Hello and welcome. My name is Megan Lovett and I serve the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry as Director of Continuing Education. Thanks to each of you for joining us for a special Spotlight on Ministry webinar. As part of our school's mission, we offer an array of enrichment opportunities to foster Christian faith and promote lifelong learning. We do this by offering presentations such as this one, as well as online courses, videos, podcasts, and other resources for personal enrichment and professional development. Our winter STM online Crossroads courses are now underway. Our next cohort of courses start today, January 27th, and include the course Grace and Commitment, the Laity. This course provides guided discussion on the laity's roles in the mission of the church. Don't miss your chance to enroll in this popular course. We have a few spots left. We are currently accepting enrollments in all of our spring courses. If you're interested in learning more about our online courses or would like to enroll in a Crossroads course, please visit our website, bc.edu/crossroads. We'll include a link in the chat. Thanks to our speaker for granting us permission to record today's webinar. As soon as the recording of today's presentation is available for viewing, likely within a month, we will notify all registered participants of the availability of the recording. At the end of the presentation, there's going to be an opportunity for question and answer, and throughout, please feel free to enter a question into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. Finally, 2 technical pieces of housekeeping for our attendees. Today's presenter will be using slides. At any point of the presentation, you are able to click on the box that shows the speaker and move it to a different side of your screen. As our speaker shares his slides, feel free to adjust the placement of the speaker box so you don't miss anything. We are also able to offer live closed captioning for today's webinar. Please click on the closed captioning button on the bottom of your screen to enable the feature. Many thanks to Doc, a graduate student here at the STM, for providing the closed captioning for us today. I now invite Father Thomas Stegman, Dean of the School of Theology and Ministry, to introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's presentation, Faith-Based Community Organizing, Social Justice in Massachusetts and the United States. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker. Louis Finfer is a community organizer with the Massachusetts Communities Action Network, MCAN for short, and was its founding director in 1985. MCAN is a network of faith-based community organizations in Massachusetts working for economic and racial justice. It was started as a community organizing training center in 1985 and has evolved into a powerful movement of faith leaders throughout Massachusetts acting on collective campaigns. MCAN does grassroots organizing with faith and community leaders across the state, working with those who are most affected by the issues of racial injustice and economic disparity. MCAN is inspired by a deep and enduring call to justice by faith traditions. MCAN has 6 affiliated faith-based community organizations working in 12 cities across Massachusetts. Louis has worked as an organizer in Massachusetts since 1970 with local community groups, tenants and affordable housing groups, and with faith-based community improvement organizations. He lives in Dorchester with his wife. They have 2 children. We are very eager to learn more about faith-based community organizing. Please join me in welcoming Lou Finfer.
Thanks very much, Father Stegman, and thanks to the team, Megan, James, and Kara at BC who helped put this together for today for your learning, hopefully. A little bit more about my background. Probably the most important first experience I had was volunteering in the civil rights movement when I was in high school. And I met people, adults who came out of the Black church and the Catholic church and the Jewish synagogue and the Protestant churches, because where I grew up, the town had an urban renewal program that had displaced half of the Black community. And our town fathers were hoping that would be the final decision. But because people came forward and organized, they were able to get the plans for new housing made real. So that was my first introduction. And then in 1970, I started work in Dorchester and worked in the 70s on neighborhood issues and learned a lot from keeping together one of the few integrated organizations in the city during the time, 1974-77 period, where desegregation and busing was pushing people apart. In the 80s, I worked with 2 affordable housing organizing groups on tenants' rights and mortgage discrimination. And since 1990, I've been working with these faith-based community organizations that we're talking about today. So a faith-based organization, I'll get more into the history and the background, but there's over 200 of these kinds of organizations like the ones that are mentioned that are part of our network and others in Massachusetts. These groups are interfaith, so they include Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim congregations. One thing that's really important about this is that there's an understanding when there's a process to create a group, to bring people together, to train, to fundraise, and so forth. But the understanding is that they're not going to work on something that may violate the faith teachings of one of the member congregations. So as you can imagine, these organizations are neither pro-life or pro-choice. There are obviously other avenues where people exercise their views on that. And so we work on the many, many things where people want to work on improving their communities and work life and so forth that bring us together. But they're interfaith organizations. They're also multi-issue. At any one time, they may work on one issue or they may work on several issues, but they see themselves as addressing issues that come forward from the members of the member congregations. They're multiracial. There's a real examination of the community, whether it's based in a neighborhood, a city, or a region. There's a real examination of the makeup of that area and an analysis and an effort to try to be representative of the makeup of the community by race and income and geography. Very important is the organization is dues-based. Each congregation pays membership dues, and they set a formula for them amongst themselves. Often it can be something like 1% of the operating budget of the congregation, but they decide together what the dues base. They do raise money from other sources. Maybe we can move to slide 3. So some of you may know of the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which is part of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. Every year around Thanksgiving, there's a second collection taking, which goes to the United States Catholic Conference for the CCHD program that's existed for more than 50 years. It's the largest source of funding for community organizing by any religious denomination in the country. Something like, I don't remember the exact number, $10 to $14 million is granted each year. 3/4 of the money goes to Washington and is dispersed by a national team of volunteers under the CCHD, and 1/4 stays in local archdioceses that make similar grants. All of the groups in our network of 6 groups are funded and have been funded by CCHD numerous times. You do have to take 3 years off, so you can't be funded forever, but it's a significant source of support from the Catholic Church. And they also, all the groups funded are involved in community organizing. And they're not social service groups. Social service groups are valuable, but the whole goal of community organizing in a certain kind of way is to create more opportunities, more programs, more money, such that people have more resources, or that social service groups have more funding to serve more people. We could move back to number 1. So this kind of organization is institution-based. You may participate in and be a member of a group where there has individual membership, which is which is certainly a legitimate way to organize, but this kind of way of organizing is done by the institutions. Some of the organizations are completely only religious congregations. Some have decided to also allow other organizations. So they may sometimes have unions or social service groups as members, or a parent PTA group or so forth as members. But they're primarily or solely congregation based. And this enables, obviously, to engage the membership of congregations that's brought together weekly or more often in each of the congregations. So it's opening the door to conversations with people who have a relationship to the institution. And if you have an individual membership organization, you have to find the individual members because you're not reaching them through necessarily an institution. So I want to go, someone wise in our field once said, you cannot organize something unless you can imagine it. You cannot organize something unless you can imagine it. So I want to share an experience with you, and we'll move to slide 4. So this is a news article about one of our groups, United Interfaith Action of Southeast Mass, that works in Fall River, New Bedford, in the Diocese of Fall River. And I worked with the clergy in forming this organization in the later 1990s. And we're going to walk through a news article about one of their, what we call public action meetings. We sometimes call these accountability meetings because they're meeting with people who have power over the issue that people are working on, and they're asking them to give specific responses to what they're asking them to do. So we'll have to see how this works out. Hopefully some of you got this in advance, and hopefully you can see it on the screen, but I'll just mention some of the highlights as we read along. The title is New Bedford Officials Offer Support to Pilot School Plan. And the pilot school plan was a proposed way of reorganizing education in New Bedford to allow teachers and principals to have autonomy to decide on the budget and the curriculum with input from parents, and to free themselves from sort of district-wide requirements to a degree, and even union requirements partially. And you can see the mayor, it says the mayor and top school officials overall gave their support at this meeting. And it describes the proposal for the small autonomous schools, and 600 people attended the meeting, including the school superintendent and 4 of the 6 members of the school committee. They held the meeting at one of the member churches, Our Lady of Mount Carmel Catholic Church, which is a predominantly Portuguese church in New Bedford. And one at a time, each official was asked 3 questions. Do they favor adopting this policy beginning in the next 2 years? Question 1. 2, would they participate in discussions over the summer to formulate an actual plan? And 3, would they actually vote in favor of the plan when it comes before the school committee in the fall? Now, when you do these meetings, these questions are given to the officials you invite beforehand. Sometimes you even have small meetings with them to go over the questions and see if they have questions about the questions. And they're told about the format and how many minutes they have to answer the questions. We don't want to have situations where an official comes and is asked a question and he or she says, "Oh, that's an interesting question. I'll have to think about that and talk to some people. We'll get back to you." No, we want answers that night, and we give the preparation to the officials so they can be equipped in good faith to come and give answers. We can move to the next slide. So it mentions the names of the school committee people who supported this. It described the organization as being made up of 16 area congregations and what they were trying to do. It also mentions that the group had learned about approaches to turn around failing schools in other cities, and they did research trips to Boston and Oakland, California, to look at successful best practices. And it further describes the plan. You can move to the next slide. The schools are smaller schools, 200 to 450 students. It quotes one of the leaders in the organization, Justine Medina, who is both a parent and a teacher, saying we want all students to be able to be a success story, and a one-size-fits-all model of education does not work for all. And then it describes how this is done in Boston. And a big issue that motivated the whole campaign is at the bottom, that 53%, at that point, 53% of the entering ninth graders in New Bedford High School did not finish in 4 years, and around 40% had effectively dropped out within, by the year after their graduation, their supposed graduation date. Next slide. It mentions it was a lively meeting. It was lively. There were 600 people there. They had songs, they had prayers, they had a faith reflection, and they had very moving, there probably about 8 moving testimonial statements by parents, teachers, and students about their experience in the school, and when people didn't believe in them and the consequences in their lives, when they either didn't finish school or were not encouraged to go beyond school to college, and so forth. So that's what happened at the meeting. Next slide. So these are some questions. I guess it's sort of hard to do a discussion like this, but the first question is, do you think if they have a good proposal, would it make a difference if 50 people had come instead of 600? So you could think about that for a moment. My experience over 50 plus years is that you definitely need good, sound, well thought out, well researched proposals, but you also need to show a lot of community support behind it, especially people being there in person to be taken seriously by elected officials as well as corporate leaders. So it does make a difference how many people come to support this. The other questions, obviously you saw significant officials came. They were asked specific questions on the issues. They heard very moving testimonies about how the problems in the schools affected people. There were commitments made by the officials. And various people, and the meeting was chaired, and the testimonies and the questions were put to the officials by volunteer leaders from the member congregations. They have a paid staff of 2 people, and that staff people obviously worked hard to work with the leaders to prepare for the meeting, but they did not speak at the meeting. Are there any questions in the chat, Megan?
Yep, there was just one question that was posed. Just a little bit of confusion of, that one question, the third question about asking the officials if they'd commit to voting when the plan hasn't been fully formulated yet.
I guess they meant would they vote for this, the concept of this that would be as presented tonight, but that would be put into a formal proposal during the summer, but would they be able to say their inclination was based on what they heard going into the meeting and tonight, would they be willing to commit to vote for it unless there was some, curveball in the proposal?
Great, thank you. That was the only question posed so far.
Okay. So maybe go back to number 1. So community organizing, obviously, in a certain kind of way, historically, community organizing obviously happened in lots of different situations throughout history in its own way. In the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, one of the chapters describes the people crying out about the oppression of charges on their land and other taxes and so forth, and mistreatment. And Nehemiah calls a meeting of all the people with the officials who are charging people those charges, and gets a commitment from them to stop doing that. So basically, the Bible is talking about the same kind of action meeting we just read about happened in that biblical context. So in a certain kind of way, this has been going on a long time, because that happened, I don't know how many thousand years ago, 3,000 plus years ago. But in the modern era, mostly people think of that unions, that community organizing grew out of unions, and the vision of unions was the responsibility of unions is to stand for people in their workplace issues and involve them. Some unions even had a bigger vision of aspiring to help with all the cradle to grave issues that people have in their lives. But usually that was not possible with their responsibilities with workplace issues. So in 1939, a man named Saul Alinsky, who had worked for John L. Lewis, who was the head of the CIO, which was the major labor organization in the country, he went and worked with some people in an area of Chicago called the Back of the Yards. It was the neighborhoods around the stockyards. If you've ever read the book in school called The Jungle, that's the area they're talking about. And they formed a community organization, and the initial members were the Catholic churches in the neighborhood, a small business organization, and the labor union were the initial members of the organization. But going forward, though religious congregations were involved, they weren't necessarily at the heart of community organizations, because they could be made up of various groups, or they could be made up of individuals. In 1974, an organizer named Ernesto Cortez, who had been an organizer for a number of years, went back to where he grew up in San Antonio, and he decided to form an organization that would be rooted in the religious congregations as the members. And out of that experience, he developed a group called Communities Organized for Public Service, with the acronym COPS, which is still an active community organization today. And they were able to do things like bring water and sewage to the Mexican-American neighborhoods that didn't even have basic water and sewage coverage in their neighborhoods, as an example. So that was in 1974, and this has grown over the years. You see listed on the screen the groups in Massachusetts. I'll read what they stand for: Essex County Community Organization on the North Shore, Brockton Interfaith Community, United Interfaith Action, Worcester Interfaith, Pioneer Valley Project, Prophetic Resistance Boston, and I Have a Future. The latter group is actually a youth organizing group, and the first 6 are faith-based community organizations that work either in the city or the region. Most of them are more regional, though their focus is on the cities in their region. There are other groups that are allies, but are not in our network of groups in Massachusetts: the Merrimack Valley Project, the Berkshire Interfaith Organization, and the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization. So those are the faith-based community organizations in Massachusetts. As I said, there's over 200 in the United States, and there are 4 national networks of that organize these groups throughout the country. And the names of those networks are Faith in Action, that we belong to, our groups. Another one is called Industrial Areas Foundation. Another one is called Gamaliel Foundation. And the 4th is called Direct Action Research and Training. The 2 that have the name foundation are not foundations in the traditional sense of giving money. It's just an historical name. So that's the kind of the scope of this. Any questions in the chat, Megan?
Yes, there have been a couple questions. One participant was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the Catholic Church's involvement in the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization.
Sure. I was the founding co-director of the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization in we began the work with clergy in 1995, and then there was a sponsoring committee formed of clergy that included a number of Catholic priests like Monsignor Frank Kelly, who's still at Sacred Heart, Father Dan Finn, who's in the used to be at St. Mark's and is in the Irish pastoral program of the Archdiocese, Father John Doyle, who was then at St. Peter's in Dorchester, but he died about 2 years ago. So there was a sponsoring committee of clergy that myself and a man named Jim Drake, who we were the co-directors, we went out and met with countless clergy over a year to have conversations about their congregation, the community issues that they saw, community issues and work issues that their congregation members were bringing to them. And we were asking them the question, is enough being done by other groups, or is enough being done by the city and state government about the problems in your community? And if not, do you think the religious congregations could have a role in doing something about that? Those are some of the questions we explored. And when we brought people together as a committee, the committee worked over about 2 years to involve more congregations, to attend trainings, to learn more about the principles and practices of faith-based organizing, to set up trainings involving their parishioners. And that work was done. And to build one of the key practices of faith-based organizations is called one-to-one relational meetings. And that's where you sit down with someone for 30 to 40 minutes and you basically share your story about, how did you get to live in this area? Why do you go to this congregation? What kind of work do you do? Are there some turning points in your life you'd like to share? And people do ask, what are you concerned about? What keeps you up at night? But we always ask, and the training is not just what problem, but we ask, why is that important to you? And we ask, is there a story about why that problem you named is so important to you? Because that's where you get at really what it's about. If you just say, what's the problem? You're taking a survey. You want to know what's in people's gut and heart. So an example, one of the people I talked to, Herman Brown in Dorchester, I said, Mr. Brown, what are you concerned about? He said, there's a lot of crime out here. You know about it. I said, I know that, Mr. Brown, but why do you name that? Why is it important to you? And he said, oh, come on, you know what's going on. You read the papers and the TV. There's a lot of things going on here. I said, Mr. Brown, I know that. But is there some story about how this affected you or people you care about that makes this so important to you? And he said to me, well, my nephew was 12 years old, was on Johnston Street and just riding his bike, and all of a sudden there was a shot rang out and he got shot in the leg just because he was in the wrong place in the wrong time. Now, not everybody has such a dramatic story about how they're linked to the problem, but if I didn't ask him, I wouldn't have learned it. And I learned something more about him. And then when you listen to people in these kinds of outreach that organizers do, but lay leaders do too, some of those stories that you hear in these conversations are the ones you want to bring to the meetings with officials, like the one we described in New Bedford and Fall River. So I'm digressing a little to get into the process, but yes, there was Catholic churches, clergy involved, and many other Catholic churches became members in the initial years. And also CCHD funded it. And in our founding meeting, Cardinal O'Malley attended our founding meeting. Obviously, this has been challenging. Everybody is aware of the impact of the priest sexual abuse scandal that had on parishes and lay leaders, and obviously that we're still living with that today. But there are still Catholic members of GBIO, as there are in all our organizations throughout the state. Other questions are in the chat?
Yes, connected to what you're sharing about input. So one of our participants was wondering how an organization comes up with the plan to move forward. Is the input from outside experts? Is the input from the congregational or member group leaders? Or is there a process of gathering the ideas from the congregants through the clergy to the community organization?
Okay, perhaps you could put slide 2 on. So this is the organizing process. The listening is under basically congregations that are members of the organization are asked to form a committee of congregation members to lead the organizing process inside the congregation and to be represented on organizational wide committees of the organization. And that group receives training on how to conduct these one-to-one relational meetings, where you're sitting down and having those kind of conversations with basically learning about people's story, background, turning points, and what they care about deeply and worry about, and the story behind it. And that can be done through one-to-one meetings. It can be done, we also teach people how to organize what are called house meetings or small group meetings, where they gather 8 to 15 people and they ask people to share a story, usually answering that question, what are you concerned about, why, and is there a story? And sometimes congregations can also ask about parish concerns. The small group meetings can be held in people's houses at the congregation. They also can be done after Mass or after services. People could be invited to come downstairs for 45 minutes and break into groups, small groups, and have a small group meeting that's moderated by one of the people on the committee of the congregation. Those committees kind of make up their own names. We generically call them local organizing ministry or local organizing committee, LOM, LOC, but sometimes they make up their own names. So out of that listening, people hear concerns, and the committee of congregation members may make a decision on what they think are the top 2 or 3 concerns of their congregation members. Then they bring them to a citywide meeting of all the other congregations. And out of that process, they usually will choose 1 or 2, sometimes 3 issues that they see as priorities. And then they begin research. That's moved to the second part where we talk about strategy. The people who are on those committees start to research about the problem. They may hear a problem like the people in New Bedford heard about different aspects of education, the dropout rate, the kids not doing well in reading and math, there being not good communication with the teachers, there's physical problems in the schools, any kind. They heard a lot of things about education. So they went and met with people involved in the schools now, teachers, principals, administration people, to ask them what they thought was working and what they were willing to say was not working and why. They would ask them what should be done about that, taking the pulse of those people. They also went and researched, as it mentioned in the article, what they called best practices. Who's doing something effective, innovative about education elsewhere that we might want to examine in case we want to use parts of that in our proposal. So they met with people in Boston who had an aspect of this called pilot schools, and they even had sent a delegation of people to Oakland, California to look at an initiative there, which is called small autonomous schools. And after all that research, the other thing they research is who makes the decision who's the responsible person to make the decision? Because you don't want to invite the city councilor to the meeting when the state representative makes the decision in the state budget, or you don't want to invite the wrong person. So you want to think about that and talk to people so you can be sure who makes the decision. And then that leads to coming up with a specific proposal. In the case of New Bedford, they said, we're going to ask for a policy to allow these small autonomous schools and a commitment in good faith to move forward on that policy. And they decided who to invite. In this case, based on the research, not only the members of the school committee, in New Bedford, the mayor is also a member of the school committee, and they also invited the superintendent, because the superintendent is really the chief staff person to the school committee. So his or her viewpoint is something they're going to care about. So that's the process going forward. Action, I described one tactic of this kind of action accountability meetings. On some issues, people will choose other tactics additionally. If you're working to change a law, you, at some point, even if you have a meeting of city councilors, mayors, or state legislators, you may have to go to a hearing held by the city council or the legislature to testify. You may need to, have a press conference with a research report. There are many tactics you can use, though, and sometimes the accountability meeting we think is the most effective because you can show the power of support behind you, and also you get to, in a sense, write the agenda, as opposed to when you go to the city council or state legislature, they write the agenda. And evaluation is done after every meeting. Every planning meeting, there's an evaluation of 10 minutes or 15 minutes at the end, basically on things you're familiar with, what worked and why, what didn't work and why, what's our next steps. So that's the organizing process. And what were the other questions, Megan?
Yeah, so a couple other questions have been added about this specifically. One of our participants was wondering about that transition from the listening in the pews to the actual justice group and then to action. So how does that transition made? So this person offered preaching, Bible study, book groups, the GBIO. What are your thoughts?
Well, some of that described, I'm going to talk about faith reflection in a moment. So maybe you could mention the other question.
Sure thing. Another participant was wondering about the specific example that we were discussing in New Bedford, that, the new schools that they're going to hopefully be implementing, is there a religious tone to it, since it came from this type of group, and how does that blend with the public school system?
Well, it's mainly that the members of the congregations, obviously some of them went to Catholic schools, but probably a larger number went to public schools, so they felt they needed to influence the quality, to improve the quality of the public schools. They are in different aspects, when they talk about curriculum, people also talk about values, but not specifically any particular religious values. Was there another question?
Yes, this one was posed a little while ago. It's specific to working with young adults. So this participant works as a campus minister at a Catholic university, and is working with a student around faith-based organizing. And one of the challenges that this person is running into is, this kind of work is usually over a long term, but the population that this person's working with, there's a lot of turnover. They're a very mobile population. And so what does student-based organizing look like, or how to get students involved with local movements on campus and the communities where the universities are located?
Well, it's a longer discussion. If they take up an issue that relates to their campus life and experience, obviously they can work within the time scale of the period they're at the university and make, but it's the same process of listening to people, doing research, coming up with a proposal, figuring out who makes the decision, and engaging them in a process of meetings that could lead to the possibility of change. If they want to get involved in the larger community, then they would need to form a, have a meeting with a local community organization and discuss ways that they could be involved. If it's a congregation-based group like this, it may be more individually. They can help with research or even with outreach, or it could be some of these groups might allow the student group to be a member as long as they did work to do the listening to other students and were able to bring forward students to participate when they took action together. Maybe we can move to slide 9. A lot of the conversation might sound like, well, they're talking about faith and they held the meeting in the church, but where's the faith? So whenever we have a planning meeting of the organization, a small group meeting of 8 to 25 people working on what I talked about, whether it happens in an individual congregational committee that I described or an area-wide committee of the organization, the meeting starts with a prayer. It has a faith reflection of maybe 10 minutes. It's sometimes offered by clergy, but it often can be done by a lay person. So this is an example of a faith reflection we've done. We take this passage from the book of Isaiah, which is really, as you skim it, it's really about the world as it should be. That people will live out their years. They will not toil in vain. They will not build houses for others and not get to live in them themselves. There will not be weeping and crying. So we read the chapter and then we ask the question about, let's look at our world in Boston, in Dorchester, in New Bedford. Is there weeping and crying? And if so, what it's about? Are people toiling in vain and low wages or not? And why is that? Do everyone get to own their own home, or a lot of people tenants because they don't have enough income to buy a home? So do all people get to live out their years as they should as elderly, let alone as youth or infants? So we examine the world as it is that God called us to create and to live in versus the world as it is now. And we're making the point that what we're doing is what God is calling us to build a world like this. So if we are moving to take on some of these things like violence and toiling in vain and insecurity in housing, we are doing what God calls us to do. So I said it very quickly, but that's an example of a faith reflection, examining scripture and how does it relate to what we're trying to do in this kind of work. Any questions about that?
Yeah, we had one of our audience members that just was expressing concern about how these are faith-based groups, but they're working with state solutions. And so how does politics influence these decisions, and how funding is used from, the church that is now being used for in more of a secular setting? And then how does that show the mission of the faith groups that are involved?
Well, it's a choice. Obviously, not every congregation will join a group like this. And everybody has, there are teachings of this. Certainly Catholic social teaching calls on us to do acts of charity and service, but also calls on us to act for justice and dealing with principalities and powers. But everyone makes a decision. Some religious congregations will say, this is too political. I mean, these organizations do not endorse candidates or work for candidates, but they may engage politicians to try to respond to what they bring forward as issues. But they're acting politically in a certain kind of way, but they're not political organizations. And some congregations will not feel comfortable with that. They would say, we see our role is service and charity. And that's fine. And that's part of the vision. I would say that's part of the vision that God calls us to do, but not all of it. So people in a sense, make a self-selection of whether they want to participate or not. And they get a chance to check out the group at various times before they decide whether to join or not. And obviously a committee of people who works on this is going to come up with a proposal. Obviously, they could propose, there could be residents who say, well, we shouldn't have small autonomous schools, that people should just buck it up and do better or something like that, that they have the right to do that. But the people from the congregations who meet together and go through this process of listening and research and coming up with a proposal are trying to do something to deal with the concerns that they heard in the listening they did. So, but again, people have to decide whether this is the right place for them as a person in a congregation, but particularly more the congregation has to decide if this is the right kind of organization they want to be part of. Because it asks a lot of people. It asks them to have a committee. It asks them to do these kinds of meetings to listen to people. It asks them to ask people to come to meetings. It asks them to pay dues. But what they get out of it is probably the key thing. There are countless hi, how are you relationships in our congregation. Hi, how are you? I know your name and I say, hi, how are you? Or a lot of times I don't even know your name and it's hi, how are you? So if you participate in a faith-based organization, you're going to build community inside that congregation. Because in that process, people are going to have many, many of these one-to-one meetings. You don't leave when you come back and see that person after you've sat down with them for 40 minutes and shared stories, you know them in a way that you didn't know them before, and you will remember that about each other. And also, people are going to build community by participating in these small group meetings that I described. So you're going to increase the community in the church. People are going to learn leadership skills that also can be used in other parts of the congregation. Also, a parish does not have to, quote, limit itself to social justice issues. Some parishes have chosen to do the listening about internal parish concerns. They can ask the question, what could our parish do to make it more a part of your life? What ministry should we start or increase to make it more a part of your life? And why? And why is that important to you? So some parishes come up with initiatives that deal with social justice issues, but also initiatives that deal with parish concerns. And that can come out of this process too. So all of that is toward building community. And again, at each meeting, there's not only opening, closing prayers, but there's a faith reflection. So we're trying to ground ourselves in scripture and other teachings about why we're doing what we're doing. I'm willing to be honest enough in conversations that I've had with priests and ministers and rabbis to say you should do this listening process every year, even if you don't belong to such a group like this, because people's concerns can change and people appreciate being listened to. And you're going to have a more vital congregation if you do some kind of a process like this, if you can, every year. I guess we should move to slide. Other questions, Megan?
They're mainly comments, so please keep going, and then we'll have hopefully a few minutes for some more questions at the end.
Move to the last slide. So these are a couple of resources. The book Activism Makes Sense by Gregory Pierce. Gregory was a seminarian who became a community organizer He works for ACTA Publications, which is a Catholic publishing house. And he wrote this book about some of the principles and practices of faith-based community organizations. And it's a very readable book, besides being short, 125 pages. He talks about the principles through stories of examples of the organization working at the parish level and at the city level. And the second book, Doing Justice, by Pastor Jacobson, is more about the theology connected to the principles. So he examines principles like one-on-one relational meetings, like self-interest, the world as it is, the world as it should be, so forth. And he examines them from a theological point of view. And the third book, Faith in Action, Religious, Race, and Democratic Organizing, is more telling stories about a number of these different organizations, about how they work, what issues they worked on it, how they did it, what obstacles they encountered, how they dealt with them. So those are some resources. There's many more articles and books. And my email is in the chat, loufinfer@gmail.com. So if people have questions that you couldn't be answered today, or if something comes up in the future related to this that you'd like to ask about, you could email me and I'll respond. If you live in Massachusetts, I listed the groups, but I could, we could send out their addresses and phone numbers or something like that. Now, not every area of the state has an organization. And if there's not an organization where you live, we could also talk to you about a process that you might to undertake to develop or deepen a committee in your own congregation, and how you might be able to either work locally or team up with one of these organizations that's at least in your region. And if you live outside of Massachusetts, I can help you connect to, there may not be an organization you're part of another state, but there are organizations like this in each of the states in our country. Other questions?
Yeah, just to that point, one of our attendees had just posted about a great organization in Hartford. She said the Greater Hartford Interfaith Action Alliance, or GHIAA, has made some significant progress in tackling some issues raised by the people from the House meeting. So I don't know if you're familiar with that one, but that one was brought up.
I am. I know that group and their director, Pat Spear. They had just had a huge meeting. The state has a practice of putting liens on people for, I think it's healthcare or assistance that they got at one point, and they put these liens on people, which is very punitive, and they're tackling that and other issues. But they're a metropolitan-wide group involving, neighborhoods of Hartford and surrounding communities. And it's similar to some of the groups I talked about, but they're a very encouraging and powerful group.
And then another participant wrote that, the plan that you had outlined for us seems to be what the base Christian communities have done, seeing, judging, and then acting. How are you inviting the community to participate?
Yes, it does draw on some of those concepts of base communities and liberation theology, but it is rooted in the parishes. Some aspects of base communities and liberation theology is done around parishes, even though it's Christian based, but these organizations are rooted in the congregations. But it's certainly influenced by some of those experiences and teachings. And even in our archdiocese, there's a long tradition of the St. James Society that has sent priests to Latin America for I don't know how many years, 70 years, and a lot of those priests, seeing the disparities and the oppressions that they saw, influenced them when they came back to America to also want to tackle some of those issues here. Father Doyle, I mentioned, who was one of the founders of Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, served in the St. James Society, and the number of other priests I have learned from that.
Thank you. No, so we're nearing our final minutes. Was there anything else you wanted to share with our group? I think we've exhausted our questions.
There's nothing. Sometimes people feel about certain politicians or corporate figures are too powerful and oppressive. But we give away our power more than it's taken from us. We give away our power more than it's taken from us. If we don't organize and be persistent, if we do organize and persistent, we are going to get something done. But if we don't organize, or if we try a little and don't follow through, that we lose in some ways more because of that than because some powerful person acts oppressively, even though some powerful people do act oppressively. So it's on us, and everybody knows there's so many inspirations in our history of things that happened in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and other movements which is why change happens. And this kind of community organization is definitely in that tradition of the civil rights movement in our times. Thank you for listening. Please do feel free to contact me with questions, suggestions, and I'll try to help as much as possible. And thank you for taking the time to spend the time listening to me. And I appreciated your questions too.
Thank you so much.
The BC.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the work that you're doing in our communities. We're so appreciative of you sharing your ministry with us today for our first Spotlight on Ministry. And thank you to our attendees for joining us this afternoon. And we will be sending out an email just with more of this information and then a link to see the recording when it is available. We hope that you all have a good rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.
Bye. Thank you.